Hi, this is teacher Kendy, and I'm your English partner today. I'll share with you some of the skills and experiences that I have in teaching. I will basically cover five main points in this presentation. Initially, the things that I point out to my students during our first class, may it be a normal lesson, a TL, or an ET. Secondly, the basic things about IELTS that we learn and practice in my class. Third are the different strokes that I do for different folks. The learning curves of different individuals are also distinct from each other, so I also have various ways in teaching them. Fourth is how I make my students aware of their mistakes. And lastly, the things that I apply to my trainees to motivate them and step up to become better than the person they were yesterday or before. Anyway, we'll go through them as we go through the slides. So, during our first class, in my case, I always give my students a mock test and BSR on our first meeting, especially if it is a TL or an ET. After showing my students their score, I also explain the IELTS band descriptors to them. And honestly, 90% of my students tell me that they have seen the IELTS band descriptors before, but they really do not understand, or they just never paid attention to it. Or maybe they were just lazy and they just didn't care to give it time. Yeah. Or maybe a portion of their time. But anyway, after discussing it to them, they learn to appreciate it as it gives them a clear view as to how they should behave in the exam for them to achieve their target. As we know, it is a uniform or universal guide for us to know what we should exhibit to the examiner when answering their questions. I also make sure that they know their current status or skills by showing their mistakes in their answers in the mock test and giving them suggestions and recommendations on how to correct them. So if time is limited, I don't really discuss all of their mistakes, but just pick the most obvious or the serious errors and also give them a summary of the things that they can improve on and as to what they can learn from attending my classes. Okay, I also, of course, show them the result of the BSR, by the way. And that will lead us to closing the deal with the student. You know, I just don't merely say goodbye to my students after we have discussed all of these, but I ask them questions like, so, when do you think can you start your classes with me? Or, how soon do you think can you attend my class? And I may also give them suggestions as to how many lessons should they purchase from TA. And I always encourage them to buy a minimum of 30 lessons and maybe just add more in the future if needed. And apart from these, I send them a thank you note to show my appreciation. Yeah, for attending our class or our trial class. And in that message, I give them a suggestion to contact TA to purchase their classes. I'm going to show you an example. I think it's here. Yeah, thank you for attending our trial class. Or I may change it into thank you for attending our first class. Kindly contact our teacher assistant so that you can purchase your classes. Have a great day. And I insert the name of the student there. Yeah, so I always send a uniform or a generic message to my students. Yeah, so if they already have available balance on their account or on the system, I attempt to book our future classes, of course, with their approval. For example, I ask them like this: I have a vacant schedule on Monday at 2 p.m. If you want, I can book the schedule for you before someone else will. So, and most likely, if the student likes you or likes the way that you teach him or her, he will most likely agree with you for you to book that. Yeah, so that's what I do. And now, um, moving on to this part. Basically, these are the basic IELTS parts. Yeah. Well, this is where we cover the usual and the rudimentary elements of IELTS speaking, which are, of course, parts 1, 2, and 3. And I discuss to them what each part is about and how we can answer them logically. Like in part 1, it is some kind of an interview or getting to know you stage in which the examiner would ask some personal questions. Part 2, on the other hand, is the long turn or the storytelling type of test. And part 3, of course, is the discussion type, which includes abstract questions, also which require them to give longer answers than those in part 1. All right. And this is different strokes for different folks. For students whose target is 6 or below 6, what I start with is building their confidence or their self-confidence. So we focus on fluency and coherence, basic sentence construction, and I teach them other words to say the common vocabulary words. For example, happy. Well, I teach them to forget the word happy and instead learn the new words like delighted, merry, joyful, glad, ecstatic, and so on. We concentrate on the students' weak points for us to improve them, and we do regular pronunciation exercise, especially on sounds or pronunciation that they struggle with. Whereas for those whose target is 6 or above, I first reinforce their strengths because that's where they can bank on, as it is their edge over others. And we go through advanced expressions, cohesive devices, or coherent devices, idioms, and we enhance their grammar skills. When we have to do a pronunciation exercise, I usually give them more complex tongue twisters. Now, I also have a different classification of my students. I divide them into slow learners and fast learners too. For slow learners, I make sure that they first have improvement on one part before moving on to the next part of IELTS speaking. And I usually take the lead for the student. What I mean is that I make the plan for our class and do it according to my timetable for that certain student, unless he or she has a better suggestion. And I type as often as needed, especially if the student finds it hard to understand. Yeah, a slow learner and at the same time maybe a low level kind of um, trainee or student. And I speak at a moderate speed, except for students who have excellent listening skills. While for fast learners, we try to practice all three parts every day. But with this type of students, I give them the freedom to choose, like which part do they want to practice first. For example, if a student requests to focus on part 2 and 3, it's okay with me. I would probably just give them a topic to answer in part 1 and see if they can really logically answer most questions. I can also type for them their mistakes and suggestions on how they can correctly use them next time. And I push them to really work on their intonation and rate of speech. Here is an example of how I point out my students' mistakes. For example, most of them actually are fond of saying Afric, like, I want to go to a wasteland in Africa, or I want to study in America. Yeah, so what I do is I type for them the words that they used incorrectly, and I type them in capital letters like these. Then I ask them if they seem to sound or look correct or not, and let them answer. Yeah. And once they have gotten the right answer, then I type it for them. I type the right word or words in capital letters too, for them to know or for them to easily review it later on. Yeah. And I put an X. Yeah. For example, in this sentence, I feel boring. I put an equal sign, like this, an equivalent sign, and an X to it to mean that it's wrong. And when I give the correct word for them to use, I just type it. I just type the correct word and I type it in capital letters. Okay. And for example, here, I feel boring. It's wrong. And also, I can give another example sentence like it's bored when you have nothing to do. So does it sound right or does it sound strange or not really natural or is there something wrong or anything wrong about it? Once the student is able to identify the mistake and correct it, I also give them suggestions. Like in this word, bored or boring, for example, the word boring, I give them alternative words like dull, mundane, flat, colorless, unstimulating, or unexciting. Yeah. So I don't only supply them with all these vocabulary words or alternative words, but I also let them try to create another or a new sentence using any or some of the new words that I gave them. Yeah. So another is earlier that was yeah when I point out their grammar mistakes. Another grammar mistake example is this. The student says, when I'm in bad mood. So I can type either that short sentence, at least it is a short sentence, or I can simply just say, in bad mood. Yeah, it's either way. So I type it for the student and ask them, or ask the student what seems to be wrong with it and how to correct it. Yeah. So the student then correct it and says, when I'm in a bad mood. So if the student is able to get the correct answer or to correct his own mistakes, I use power words like perfect, awesome, good job, and so on. Yeah. And after that, I ask them if they know some other words to say in a bad mood or other expressions which mean the same. Yeah. So will probably talk about it, and if they really can't think of anything else, then I recommend some expressions like these. When I'm feeling down and blue, or when I'm down in the dumps. Another, or yeah, furthermore, this is the way that I often give pronunciation corrections. Most of them love the word holistic. I don't know where did that come from. I haven't seen that word before in the dictionary. But anyway, um, yeah. So the same procedure is what I do. I type the mispronounced word in caps or in capital letters and try to give them or try to have them think of the right way to say it. So, for example, yeah, I also give these different things to them. So not only that I correct their pronunciation, I don't only tell them it should be politics. Yeah. So aside from that, aside from supplying them with the correct word, I also show them how to syllabicate the word. Like politics, politics. So there are three syllables for this word. And I also show them the correct way to pronounce it. Yeah, politics. And same with the word diabetes. Yeah, I've heard it, I think, twice that a student said diabetes, but we know that it should be diabetes. Yeah, so it's the same. I write the correct word in capital letters. I syllabicate the word, and there are two ways to pronounce this word actually, and I show both of those to the student. So it's either diabetes or diabetes. And of course, the usual drill, I let the candidate or the student repeat the word two or three times. And not only that, I also teach them the different words that we can relate to politics or diabetes. Like for politics, we also have policy, politician, political. And for diabetes, we have similar word, diabetic. They sound similar, or I mean, they look similar, but they really sound distinct, and of course, they have different meanings. Okay, so let's move on to motivating students and stepping up. Yeah, okay. Well, for first timers, as it is their first time to take an online lesson, or maybe as well as the IELTS exam, the first thing I do is define IELTS to them. Yeah. Um, well, then I set proper expectations, actually, and tell them what I will be doing in our class. How will I help them improve their English proficiency, and also answer some additional or introductory questions that the examiner may ask them. Questions like, are you studying or working? Or may I see your ID card? And so on. I also teach my students how to respond to those questions or queries. On the other hand, for retakers or those who already took the exam before, I review with them the sequence of the IELTS oral test and ask if they already know the methods of answering the different questions in different parts of the exam, and also ask them which is the most challenging part for them, highlight their strengths, and focus more on their weaknesses. I also get information as to how they performed in their last exam and give them suggestions as to, as how they can do it better next time. Yeah. So these now are the things that apply to all of my students. Proper goal setting. This is related to the IELTS band descriptor. And again, it is knowing what we are working for and what we should work on, and being realistic as what we need to display to the examiner on that day of the exam. I help my students understand what does the examiner want to hear, and what they want to hear when they answer different kinds of questions. Yeah. And also how they can present themselves confidently and to avoid being nervous. In doing so, I give some personal tips and ideas based on my experiences in the past, and tell my students that most people around them for sure didn't achieve proficiency in English overnight, but they worked hard for it. So if those people could do it, they also can. Okay, so what's more? Yeah, for me, these next items are crucial to make your students love you and continue to attend your classes. We can gain their trust and confidence on your teaching if you first respect them as individuals. Also, by showing empathy and interest when they answer or have some small talks with you. Sometimes those chats are really not that interesting, but they are ways for your students to gauge or detect if you are a good listener or not. If I were in their shoes, I would also want to get my money's worth. So I'd like to know what my teacher can help me with. I'd like to know what she or he is like. Is she patient, knowledgeable, dependable, professional, proficient, and maybe fun to talk with? So these are the things that I always bear in mind. If a teacher has these characters, she can surely gain her students' loyalty and trust, of course. Um, and of course, I also give them homework and some tasks to do as something that we can also do and look forward um, or talk about in our next class. There are some additional things and skills that I teach them or do with them as an exercise to help my students improve in different aspects of oral English. So, above all, I encourage them to speak their mind through forming a mental image or even playing a video in their head. Yeah. So I also make use of the QQ translator and Google Translate as a rescue tool when they are, when they are really struggling or they're trying, but they cannot express their thoughts or a certain word in English, which I think is very common, based on my observation, is very common when the topic is about Chinese food. Just like the example on this page. Yeah. Doji. Yeah. There was one student who actually talked about food to me, yeah, and he was trying to explain a specific or a certain food which I really couldn't imagine. Yeah, because his speaking skill was also not that high yet at that time. So I asked him to type it or to show it to me in Chinese characters, and I made use of Google Translate. And then we realized that it's bean juice. So this is one way that I actually help my students to express their thoughts and to know some English vocabulary or the equivalent English words for the Chinese things that they're struggling with. So I think doju is a popular soup or drink in Beijing. Yeah, if I remember it correctly. Okay. Um, Generally, yeah, constant practice is what all students need. So I encourage them to have classes as often as possible and on a daily basis, if possible. Speaking is also not just about what you say, but how you say it. So I persuade them to add their feelings or emotions when speaking for them to sound more natural and not monotonous. For example, when talking about something happy or exciting, we should not say it like, we were all very delighted and it was the best time of our lives. That's lifeless. But I try to demonstrate it to them. Like if you're talking about something happy, then you should also sound happy. Smile and say, you can imagine how delighted we all were. And we even can consider it as the best time of our lives. So that sounds natural, and at the same time, you seem to be also very happy about the thing that you're talking about. So do not be monotonous, is what I teach them. Okay. And this is an interesting picture. Yeah. Or an interesting slide. And it's one other way for me to let my students speak and let their ideas flow through picture interpretation exercises. Here, a student can think of and talk about as much vocabulary, words, and expressions that he can relate to the picture. And I also teach them how to think outside the box. Like in this picture, the obvious things are there are four people, there are two old people, I think, and two younger ones. So probably they are members of one family. Three of them have short hair, and one who's wearing a red shirt has a longer and curly hair. They're inside a car and they're all wearing the Minions goggles. And I go through with not so blunt information with my student to analyze the situation. So, like in this picture, the car looks so spacious, and there is still more room in the back of the two girls. So, probably they're in a van or in an SUV and not a small car. The old man in front has eyeglasses as well as a pen clipped on his shirt, so he's probably a businessman or he just finished his work. And because they all have the same goggles, I think all of them are fond of the movie Despicable Me. And actually, they look like the minions in that movie, which are really quite funny. Yeah. I think they're enjoying a happy time together. Yeah, so this is how I teach them to interpret some pictures to help them with the flow of their ideas in their mind. Another is this kind of grammar quizzes. If a student is struggling with any part of grammar, I will give him a quiz like this. So, this is about adjectives and prepositions. And this is just a portion of a long quiz, actually. So, I let the student read it aloud and answer all the questions first before discussing the answers. And the quiz that I give depends on which part do they need to study or learn or improve on. I suggest that they actually keep photos of the questions and answers of these quizzes as their guide later on in case they might forget how to properly use the words in their sentences. Yeah. And I also give them pronunciation exercises like this. Basically, they are short stories focusing on a specific sound. And in this short story, we highlight we highlight and practice the N sound. So it's the same thing. I let my student read the story aloud and later show them and practice with them the words that they mispronounced. This is one way for the students not only to improve their pronunciation but also to learn some new words. Talking about words, another way to help them figure out new words is I give them some files or documents which are related to some topics in IELTS, such as this example, which is a screenshot of only a portion of a document about family. It includes the words, their meanings, and also example sentences to guide them how to, or to guide the students how to use them. I give this as a homework to my students so that they can browse through the document and try to create their own sentences using these words during their spare time. And in our next meeting, I will let them talk about the things that they have learned from the file and apply them in answering questions related to family or family members. Yeah, from the list of topics that we have. And one other way for me to emphasize continuous improvement is to, you know, um, is for me to forbid my students to use some common words or overused words. And these are some examples of the words that I ban in my class, like beautiful or good. Yeah, good. Um, Actually, good is really the topmost overused word. Yeah, and well, we have to accept it. There are really hundreds of words to replace good. So I don't really like hearing my students use good as an adjective for them to use in their answers, as well as beautiful, delicious, expensive. Yeah. And let me lay stress on the first word there, good. I cultivate their vocabulary by replacing this word with words like awesome, excellent, amazing, spectacular, brilliant, etc. Okay. And I think for me, the best way for everyone to learn English is through language immersion. I encourage my students to read books or even just a short article in English. Also, to watch English movies, TV shows, online videos, and even download English apps. Also, if they can find a friend who is also studying English, who they can converse with or communicate with in English, then that would be better. Plus, they can also sing songs in English. Yeah, or listen to English music if they're into music. Yeah. Through immersing oneself in English materials, he or she can improve better than those who don't do it. I also let my students know that they can ask for help from me anytime, but they have to also consider that I have other classes, so I may reply late. I am open for suggestions, clarifications, and I also welcome questions. Well, I really love motivating my students. Yeah, and to boost their self confidence, uplift their spirits, let them know that they're being heard, to give them hope, to inspire them to push themselves to their limits and to finally achieve their goals. I always tell them that the more effort you exert, the faster their hard work will pay off. As the saying goes, life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage and hard work. Yeah. So now I just want to share the things that I do not like to do in my class or to my students. Well, first is to attend the class or to attend the class late unless there is a serious situation or really an emergency. I don't speak in a rush or mumble the words that I utter, and I don't ignore my students' feelings or conditions. For example, if they feel bad, like maybe it's obvious that they're suffering from colds and they cannot concentrate or answer the questions well, I don't get mad. I don't get mad or get impatient with them, but I always try to understand their situation. And I give them pieces of advice on how they can take care of their health so that they can perform well or better next time. And I never make my students feel bad or be rude towards them. And lastly, I never give up on my students and on improving myself to teach them better each time. So, to wrap it all up, I can say that consistency of those things that I talked about the key. Is the key to transform students from or students who are like this picture of a scared and unconfident person on the left to become a cheerful and self assured person or confident person on the right side of this slide. So, and that's all. That would be it. This is how I race together with my students to achieve success. Thank you.